I'm Gray.
And I am Emily.
George Washington was born in Westmoreland County in Virginia on the 22nd of February in 1732. His parents were Augustine Washington and Mary Bell, and married in 1731. George Washington's family had a good background and a plantation with amazing assets. George Washington's father died when George was just 11 years old. After this happened, George Washington lived with his half-brother Lawrence at Mount Vernon. During this time, George Washington learned how to survey land. George Washington was a well-educated and a genius when it came to math. 9 years after he began to live with him, Lawrence passed away as well. George Washington then gained full ownership of Lawrence's previous land, Mount Vernon.
George Washington followed what was in his blood and joined the military and became a major in the Virginia militia. Later, George Washington got a special mission from the governor of Virginia to force the French out of the Ohio Valley. So, George Washington sent troops in, which caused the 7 Years' War. At the beginning of the war, the British were losing majorly. Later, they realized strategies to gain victory. The British were victorious and the French were soon pushed out of Canada, ending the war with the Treaty of Paris. This experience gave George Washington the experience needed to command in the American Revolution. He was not offered a placement in the British Army.
George Washington married Martha, and though he did not have children of his own, he helped raise Martha's children from one of her previous relationships. He also helped raise 4 children and several nieces and nephews. George Washington later became a politician, staying in Virginia, and after some time, George Washington was chosen to become a delegate of Virginia in the First Continental Congress.
George Washington agreed with some others that colonists were being treated unfairly by the King of Great Britain. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War started, so the Second Continental Army decided to set up their own army, with George Washington volunteering as the commander of the Continental Army. George Washington was made for this position. This was partly because he wasn't afraid of taking any risks. There were many battles fought, such as the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Quebec, Charleston, Trenton, Saratoga, Rhode Island, and Yorktown. At the beginning of their fight, the Americans were struggling, but eventually George Washington came up with new and better tactics that would later bring the Americans to be named victorious, with help from the French. Although there was a slight price to pay for this. During one winter during the war, the Americans stayed at Valley Forge for refuge. The ventilation in the cabins was very bad and made soldiers sick. Not only that, but they were starving as well. There was also an illness passing through the group, so George Washington made a risky choice and chose to infect all the healthy soldiers and use that as an antiviral. This was a smart move because it worked. Later, to get the soldiers' minds off of their hunger and coldness, George Washington had von Steuben train them. After this, the training paid off and the Americans had better skills to do George Washington's strategies. After their victory, the Americans began setting up their own government in hopes to abolish any tyranny that might come to be. George Washington was chosen to lead the Constitutional Convention, allowing him to sign the Constitution along with the other founding fathers. Only the best was chosen for presidency in the first national election, in which was George Washington. In 1789, George Washington was sworn into presidency and was later elected for the second time, though George Washington refused to run for a third term because he did not want to be like a king.
George Washington earned the name of the Founding Father, which is mostly used to acknowledge him today. Sadly, George Washington became sick and passed away in 1799 at his home, Mount Vernon. You may not know this, but being the first president of the United States, George Washington did many firsts, such as the precedents he had set and other things. For example, George Washington established relationships with Great Britain with Jay's Treaty. England is still one of America's closest and strongest allies to this day. Some other fun facts is when George Washington was younger, he did not chop down a cherry tree and confess to it. The myth that he did it is false. George Washington also had multiple sets of dentures, but none of them were made of wood. His dentures were made of ivory, metal alloys, and even the teeth of other humans, possibly slaves. And that's it. Hope you learned a lot about George Washington.